Hi everyone, and welcome back to Stellar HFY. First, thank you. The support you've shown lately has been incredible. Every comment, theory, and breakdown you've posted pushes these stories further. Today, we're stepping into a hall where Dominion cadets laughed at Earth's tactics, where humans were labeled reckless, erratic, expendable. And then one battle changed everything. Let's find out why. The Ostrexi Dominion valued symmetry of rank, of form, of battle. Its war colleges drilled doctrine as if it were physics. Orbital superiority dictated ground velocity. Forward breach lines were set to yield within a 3-minute tolerance window. No action was permitted without uplinked confirmation from command. For centuries, the system held. Doctrinal precision shaped entire theaters, and deviation was treated as both a tactical error and a cultural insult. Among the 17 client species absorbed into Dominion service, humans ranked near the bottom. They were classified as auxiliaries, irregulars used for colonial rotation, fortification labor, and shock line attrition. Dominion cadets joked that Terrans fought with chaos and won by accident. They had neither uniformity nor predictive discipline. To the Dominion, they were blunt instruments. That made Field Marshal Darren Voss a subject of quiet disdain. His collapse war record was substantial: 6 planetary stabilizations, 4 insurgency suppressions, and the only recorded instance of a successful counter-extraction under Dominion orbital lock. But Earth's integration into the Dominion had been conditional. Voss, like other high-ranking Terrans, was folded into the Auxiliary Corps, stripped of independent command authority, and assigned to frontier zones where tactical error could be written off as attrition. His current posting, Regimental Group 81, operated from a mobile staging base near the Traxxas Fold, an unstable corridor of subcrustal ridgelines and fragmented mining settlements recently seized by Havran rebels. Intelligence labeled it a minor insurrection. The Dominion response: deploy human auxiliaries first to make contact, hold reserves in orbit, observe, then clean up. Voss said nothing when the order came. He reviewed the terrain topology in silence, issued deployment instructions without requesting uplink guidance, and initiated a full regimental drop along a scatter pattern descent. Dominion observers flagged it immediately. There was no grid alignment, no staging buffer. Human units disembarked in non-standard spacing, bypassed designated recon paths, and established fallback points far outside assigned radius markers. Audit drones dispatched by Ostrexi Command captured what they believed was disarray. Flanking units vanished into canyon fractures without confirming zone security. Airdrop mortar rigs appeared in elevation zones not marked for artillery clearance. From orbit, it looked sloppy, borderline insubordinate. 72 hours later, the fold was quiet. Dominion Command received confirmation from local intercept towers. Havran comms went dark within the first day. Perimeter sentries went offline by nightfall. By the third day, every known insurgent cluster had either been neutralized or had surrendered to human patrols. Ostrexi Fleet Command sent in confirmation units expecting to find a bloodbath: auxiliary overextension, uncoordinated assault, unsustainable losses. Instead, they found something far harder to explain: forward choke points laced with Havran dead in tightly grouped formations, as if herded into kill zones. Pulse grenades rigged to mineral saturation pockets had caused cascading electroshock failures in Havran shielding. Makeshift elevation turrets built from mining equipment guarded captured compounds that hadn't even been in Dominion mission parameters. Human losses: 27. Total enemy units neutralized: over 600. The numbers were clear. The method wasn't. Ostrexi war analysts began the audit. Field reports from Voss's command were sparse. No poetic language, no doctrinal justifications, just movement patterns and after-action timestamps. Dominion analysts flagged it as anomalous. There were no standard formation markers, no compliance tags, no orbital uplinked confirmations. In fact, much of what had occurred fell outside every prescribed framework. One analyst called it chaotic adaptation. Another, off the record, called it tactically unnerving. Voss's entire regiment had acted as if the terrain itself was a co-commander, shaping their lines not through force but pressure, containment, and predictably triggered panic. The Ostrexi High Command summoned Voss. Not for commendation, there was no doctrine under which his actions could be formally recognized. His unit had technically violated Dominion engagement sequence, bypassed fire authorization procedures, and restructured a frontline operation without requesting tactical overlays. The results were undeniable. The process to the Dominion was incomprehensible. Voss stood before them without apology. He gave no strategic monologue, no defense. He didn't challenge their hierarchy. He didn't have to. The fold was quiet. The Dominion was confused. That, he understood, was enough. For now. The cadets who watched the footage of Trax's fold later didn't understand what they were seeing. To them, it looked like failure by structure. To the humans in the footage, it was something else entirely. Not chaos, not chance. Just a different kind of war. One the Dominion had never learned to fight, and one they were no longer able to ignore. The Dominion didn't celebrate victories it couldn't explain. It dissected them. The moment the fold went quiet, review teams from the Ostrexi Tactical Bureau were dispatched, not to honor Field Marshal Voss, but to contain the implications of what had just occurred. Victory outside doctrine wasn't a triumph. It was a liability, especially when that victory came from a species whose tactical record was written off as improvisational bluster. Dominion analysts moved quickly, pulling drone footage, seismic telemetry, helmet cams, and heat signature overlays. From orbit, Trax's fold had looked like a fluke. Up close, it looked worse. Calculated, systemic, and entirely non-Dominion. The footage didn't show cohesion in the traditional sense. There were no synchronized fire formations or uplinked telemetry markers. What it showed instead were advanced teams creating false retreat lines through open quarry trenches, triggering rock slides at intervals precisely aligned with Havern fallback maneuvers. Secondary units planted pulse mesh mines not at choke points, but inside abandoned fuel shafts likely to be used for shield recharge. Dead Haverns weren't scattered. They were grouped, clustered in narrow death zones, where they'd been funneled without ever realizing it. One analyst noted that entire combat sequences had occurred outside the visual cone of Dominion drone observation. That wasn't carelessness. It was intentional blackout strategy. Human troops had left Dominion surveillance blind, but not their own. The findings forced a contradiction. If Voss had followed standard procedure, the fold would likely still be contested. But by not following it, he had violated Dominion military law. The breach was labeled as unauthorized autonomy. It was a term reserved for client species who acted outside established combat architecture. An accusation more serious than insubordination, but not quite rebellion. Voss had bypassed staging directives, rewritten formation parameters in real time, and redeployed assets without requesting orbital validation. The Dominion had spent centuries perfecting command latency. Voss had functioned without it entirely. By the second day of review, the Dominion found itself trapped. The frontier colonies, especially the mineral governors of Cetis and Veleron, were already broadcasting praise for the lightning-fast human suppression force. Diplomatic envoys from neutral systems were citing the fold pacification as evidence of Dominion responsiveness. A court-martial would undercut that narrative. But silence would signal acceptance of tactical deviation. The War Council needed a middle ground. Voss was demoted formally, removed from Joint Command eligibility, reassigned to a non-strategic auxiliary post, and barred from future direct engagements with Dominion officers in theater. It was meant to be a quiet burial, but Voss didn't resist. He accepted the reassignment without protest. No appeal, no public statement, no counter-narrative. He simply returned to his field command rotation. To the Dominion elite, it was proof of submission. To the auxiliary corps, it was something else entirely. A silent confirmation that strategy didn't need a podium to reshape a battlefield. Inside the Dominion academies, the reaction fractured along predictable lines. Senior instructors dismissed Trax's fold as an anomaly. Cadets, especially those in the final strata of War College certification, began watching the playback privately. It spread in internal circles, first as mockery, then curiosity. How did a unit with no doctrinal coordination achieve a higher operational success rate than the Academy's own projected simulations? On Floor 7 of the Marvox 3 College, A group of engineering track cadets ran a silent variant of the fold scenario through Dominion battle software. With standard response patterns input, the human success rate dropped by 78%. That test was never reported. At the same time, whispers began to circulate among Dominion mid-theorists, those not yet embedded in senior war doctrine, but responsible for real-time predictive simulations. Some quietly flagged Voss's tactics under a new tag: variable entropy warfare. It wasn't formal. It didn't exist in Dominion indexes, but it sparked a pattern, an acknowledgement that human irregularities might not be flaws, but structures of a different kind. Still, the official narrative held. Voss was reprimanded. Humans were not to deviate again. The Dominion remained the sole architect of operational doctrine. But in the mess halls, the barracks, and the war colleges, something had shifted. Voss's name, absent from official commendations, began showing up in unauthorized after-action sim modules. Always buried, always silent, always there. The results were reproducible. The patterns were real, and no one in command had an answer. Not yet. 6 days after Traxxas Fold went quiet, Dominion logistics vessels began their scheduled descent to re-establish resource flow across the outer corridor. The operation was routine: supply trains running heavy with Terra stabilizers, modular housing units, and forward fusion stacks meant to replace the scorched shell of the mining colonies. Dominion infantry units remained on orbital standby, awaiting authorization from Fleet Command before touching ground. No one expected contact. The Havran insurgency was presumed extinguished. Dominion war doctrine emphasized containment after victory, not re-engagement. But Voss had seen the pattern before, and he wasn't waiting for orders. The Havrans didn't broadcast their return. They slipped in low through the canyon mouth at Axon Point, below the satellite blind spot known since the first wave. 2 fractured insurgent cells had reassembled, not to reclaim territory, but to raid and cripple incoming supply units, a tactic straight from collapse war playbooks. Their formation wasn't subtle, but it was fast, designed for sharp disruption: breach cargo hulls, destroy anchor pylons, disappear before a full response could form. It should have worked. Dominion forces had no terrestrial units on the ground, and their automated sentries were offline pending reinitialization. But before the first convoy hit surface dust, the valley erupted. A cascade of detonations tore through the Havran approach columns before they ever reached the depot lines. Half of their advance force was buried under a directional slide. Pre-cut shale ridges collapsed by precision explosives. The rest were funneled into a series of tight elevation drop-offs where human recon squads were already waiting. Within 9 minutes, it was over. No Dominion unit had deployed. No orders had been transmitted. No uplinks had been requested. Voss's auxiliary regiments, stationed kilometers away and officially still in transit, had already been in place before the Havrans arrived. Fleet Command scrambled to understand. Dominion command relays showed no early warning. No sensor alert had triggered from orbital satellites. And yet humans had struck with surgical precision, without centralized tracking, without real-time command, without permission. The first theory blamed coincidence. Then came the terrain scans. Dominion forensic teams found small hex-pulse nodes embedded beneath sediment along the likely Havran approach paths. They weren't mines or sentries, just motion-sensitive beacons programmed to transmit short-range burst pings when disrupted. They hadn't been visible on standard Dominion scans. They hadn't needed to be. Voss had predicted the Havran fallback maneuver before the fold even ended. The predictive markers had been seeded during the mop-up phase of the first campaign. Not as traps, but as early indicators of enemy behavior, silent flags for potential resurgence. It wasn't improvisation. It was forecasting, one built not on real-time analysis, but historical insurgency patterns, reactive terrain modeling, and probabilistic timing based on Dominion logistical protocol. In other words, Voss had guessed, and the guess had been right, devastatingly so. Dominion Command was forced to acknowledge the results, though they couldn't condone the method. Once again, no doctrine had been followed. Dominion manuals didn't include decentralized predictive warfare outside of reconnaissance exercises, and yet the insurgency was crushed before it began. Analysts inside the Ostrexy Tactical Division had no formal framework to categorize what had happened. One group flagged it as low-structure anticipatory modeling. Another, less concerned with political language, submitted a draft note labeling it anomaly-based heuristic system behavior. The term stuck informally at first, never spoken aloud in command chambers, but it started appearing in sidebars of after-action white papers, always in lowercase, always unacknowledged. On the academic levels, the reaction was no longer uniform. Dominion cadets still learned by simulation, by gridline, by probability trees structured around 3 response iteration cycles, but some of them had started to spend their off hours differently. They accessed the restricted feeds of fold and action point footage, clipped segments of helmet feeds, declassified motion maps of terrain shaping, audio logs that weren't meant to be educational, but showed results no Dominion simulation had ever produced. They watched human squad leaders call audibles in real time, adjusting positions not by broadcasted order, but by intuition shaped from the environment. They tracked how no 2 regiments moved the same way, but all moved with the same goal: execution over protocol. In the official lecture halls, Dominion officers continued their formal dismissal. Terran irregularity, they said. Anecdotal success. But behind closed doors, small groups of cadets ran unsanctioned war games, modifying Dominion doctrine trees with Terran-style heuristic forks. Some of those simulations failed, but others didn't. One simulation recorded a 63% increase in enemy suppression time using terrain-aligned unpredictability markers modeled after Voss's Axon deployment. That record was quietly deleted from the server 3 hours later. Voss never responded to the second ambush. He didn't submit a battle report or an incident brief. He didn't have to. The silence from the Havrans was louder than any declaration. For a second time, Dominion victory had been secured without a single Ostrexy officer engaging the enemy. For a second time, the logic of their entire command structure had been bypassed by a man who no longer held official tactical authority. And still, the Dominion chose not to speak of it. But in the minds of its future officers, the seed had been planted. Doctrine had its purpose. But something else, something earthborn, irregular, unwelcome, was beginning to feel more dangerous than heresy. It was starting to feel useful. Kren Pass was chosen for its natural bottlenecks and satellite occlusions, a training ground where Dominion cadets could simulate live combat conditions without the risk of enemy contact. For Drill 6, the annual joint exercise between Ostrexy Elite and Terran auxiliaries, the terrain had been retrofitted with modular bunkers, seismic decoys, and sensor relay towers. Dominion instructors called it a proving valley. Voss's regiment, though not formally reinstated into Dominion Tactical Command, had been granted temporary alignment status for the exercise. The Dominion considered it generous. For Voss, it was an opportunity. From the start, the cadets regarded their human counterparts as background noise, biological clutter moving too fast, too unpredictably, without procedural clarity. The Ostrexy commander, Cadet Major Varn Telros, had said as much in his opening address. "Let them run their simulations. We will run the war." Dominion cadets took position along structured quadrants, following synchronized breach check intervals and staggered approach cadence. Human units ignored the timing grid entirely. Voss had sent them ahead by 13 minutes, planting sensor flags and marking terrain hazards. From the ridgelines, Ostrexy observers logged multiple deviations. Dominion doctrine was being violated. Before the exercise had even begun, none of them noticed the signal burst. It came from low-bandwidth compression, a pirate packet ping embedded in the exercise frequency. It lasted 4 seconds, enough for 5 ships to triangulate the cadet staging zone. No one saw the leak until the first ground-to-air tracer hit the forward relay tower. The pirate incursion wasn't organized military. It didn't need to be. The mercenaries were ex-Havran gunners with Dominion armor mods, looking for an easy supply score and a chance to humiliate one of the Dominion's most elite academies. They dropped fast, low, and hot, skipping pre-assault bombardment to preserve materiel. The Ostrexy cadets froze, not from cowardice, from training. Doctrine mandated uplink confirmation before escalating from simulation to live-fire engagement, until the Central Combat Authority confirmed threat classification Any response risked disciplinary tribunal, so they held. Telros shouted for verification. 3 cadets went to ground and activated their shellnet protocols. They were following procedure exactly as they'd been taught, which meant they were 20 seconds too late. Voss's men had already begun. What the cadets hadn't realized was that Voss had staged the valley for asymmetric defense during his so-called scenario realism prep. His team had embedded shaped charges under the shale crest line. Seismic sinks laid not along the Dominion's designated collapse points, but where pirate ships would likely touch down based on trajectory curve and terrain slope. The charges weren't ornamental. They were live. The first detonation severed the northeast ravine wall, forcing the pirates to redirect toward the canyon floor. The second volley collapsed the central bluff, blocking retreat. By the time the mercenaries were within visual contact of the cadet line, they were already funneled into an artificial kill zone, an engineered basin preloaded with fragment lines and overwatch nests. Voss's men didn't wait for uplink. They didn't ask for confirmation. They moved. In 6 minutes, it was over. The pirates had no chance to reorganize. Those who tried to scatter were cut down by overlapping fire arcs from human squads already positioned above the entry chutes. Others were buried beneath secondary blast folds triggered from handheld field controls. No Dominion cadet fired a shot, not because they weren't ready, but because the threat didn't survive long enough to reach them. When the smoke settled, the only sound left in the valley was the low groan of cooling soil. The Ostrexi cadets stood still, weapons still in safety lock, looking out over a battlefield that hadn't waited for them. They weren't angry. They weren't humiliated. They were stunned. Instructors tried to regain composure, called for after-action reports, cited breach of engagement protocol. But even Telros didn't repeat the phrase, chaotic auxiliaries. Not anymore. Voss gave no speech. He didn't explain the charges. He didn't issue a debrief. His men packed up quietly, marked coordinates for recovery teams, and left the cadets to walk the perimeter of a valley that had become their first real exposure to warfare, not drawn in simulation grids but shaped in decision time. Later that night, 2 cadets from Telros's unit replayed the helmet feed alone in the barracks. They rewound the moment Voss's men moved. No uplink, no command bark, no hesitation. Just the terrain, the timing, and the choice. One of them, a tactical analyst in training, whispered something that neither repeated aloud. They weren't disobeying orders. They were obeying the battlefield. In the weeks to follow, copies of the Drill 6 footage circulated quietly. Dominion officials tried to contain the spread, citing operational risk. But the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. The question that had haunted the Fold and Axon Point was no longer whispered. It was being studied. Not every doctrine came from the top down. Some rose from the dirt, where the charges were buried before anyone thought to ask why. The footage from Drill 6 reached the War Council before the recovery teams left Kren Pass. By then, Dominion news channels had already circulated sanitized clips showing smoke curling from the valley floor and cadets standing untouched amid wreckage. The official headline read, "Joint exercise disrupted by pirate forces, secured by coalition response." It didn't mention that only one side had responded. It didn't mention that the Dominion's elite had been paralyzed by their own procedures. And it certainly didn't mention that the man responsible for saving them had been demoted less than a month prior for doing exactly what he'd done again. Within the council chambers, the debate fractured instantly. The old guard, flagged by the central bureaucratic arm of the High Defense Directorate, condemned what they called chaos doctrine, a tactical philosophy based on intuition, terrain improvisation, and untraceable chain of command. They warned of collapse if Dominion structure absorbed such methods. They referenced centuries of stability, 14 pacified systems, and the near-universal compliance their military had maintained across client species. But their arguments no longer moved as freely as they once had. Frontier Command, the voices closest to real conflict, stationed in sectors where doctrinal lag got people killed, argued differently. They had watched the events at Traxxas Fold. They'd seen the Havren resurgence crushed before they'd even scrambled ships. And now they had Drill 6, irrefutable evidence of Dominion officers surviving not because of their training, but in spite of it. Colonies dependent on swift conflict suppression had begun issuing quiet directives to mimic Voss's unit layout patterns. The simulation feedback from joint academies showed performance spikes wherever. Irregular recursion patterns were inserted. Field results were speaking in louder terms than theoretical discomfort. The vote for Directive T-47 was closer than expected, but it passed. For the first time since Earth's annexation, human irregular tactics were ordered to be formally integrated in Dominion military curricula. Not as cultural study, not as anomaly, but as doctrine. The announcement rippled through every layer of Dominion infrastructure. The war colleges issued the update with clinical detachment. Entropy-aligned response models to be trialed alongside sequential escalation. But the subtext was louder than the phrasing. Terran battlefield logic, once called expendable, once mocked as noise, was now a mandatory component of officer education. Field Marshal Darren Voss received no public apology. That wasn't how the Dominion operated. But a private directive reinstated him, not as a commander, but as an architect. His new title was Tactical Integration Officer, Irregular Systems Division. He would oversee the translation of Terran warfare into Dominion framework, line by line, maneuver by maneuver, all of it filtered through the cold structure that once had no place for it. It was not a return to power. It was the invitation to shape something larger than his rank had ever allowed. The appointment sent ripples through Dominion military culture. Some officers resigned. Others transferred away from joint units. Within the academies, pockets of resistance formed, bitter at what they saw as the dilution of Dominion purity. But the war colleges didn't slow. Cadet programs were restructured. Simulation baselines now included stochastic interrupt layers. Scenario instructors began introducing uncertainty, not as error, but as design. What had once been dismissed as recklessness was now modeled with mathematical precision. Voss said little through it all. He didn't correct the instructors. He didn't push back against the rewrites. He simply watched as strategy reassembled itself, piece by piece in the halls that had once excluded him. When he arrived at Marvox 3, it wasn't the same facility that had rejected Terran units years prior. The old auxiliary barracks were gone, replaced by a repurposed command wing marked Joint Doctrine Annex. The walls were still Dominion steel, still symmetrical, still spotless. But the cadets inside moved differently now. Some still watched him with guarded eyes. Others glanced at him the way soldiers do when they've read a name too many times in their training materials to ignore. He walked the corridor without ceremony. No guards, no flag. Just steps echoing through a building now filled with simulations shaped from the same battlefield that once had no place in Dominion memory. He paused at the entrance to the main planning chamber, where a new generation of officers would begin learning a kind of warfare that didn't start with protocol, but with judgment. The system that had once buried him had now been rebuilt on the foundation he never asked to pour. And though it remained Dominion by name, something had shifted. Doctrine was no longer a fortress. It had become a question. And the first answer was Earth. The Joint Doctrine Annex at Marvox 3 no longer echoed with laughter at human strategy. The cadets moved with discipline, as they always had, but now there was a difference in how they paused, in where their eyes went on the simulation walls. Rows of Dominion officers in training sat in staggered formation, heads bowed not in prayer, but in analysis. They weren't studying Dominion battle symmetry or Ostrexi orbital cascade models. They were watching footage of a human corporal using the slope of loose shale to redirect a Havren charge, timing a controlled slide with improvised explosives to trigger a collapse before the enemy understood what terrain they were standing on. The moment had been clipped from Axon Point, labeled Case File Entropy Junction 4B. There was no commentary, no music, no speech, just cause and effect. The curriculum had changed. Simulation layers now included environment as agent variables, autonomous subcommand modules, and unconfirmed rapid decision scenarios. Officers were taught not just how to respond, but how to create silence, to strip an opponent of structure and let the terrain speak louder than orders. The term entropy theory had gone from whispered heresy to a cornerstone concept. Instructors described it not as chaos, but as recursive adaptation, a method of building shape from pressure, not from blueprint. The most advanced coursework focused on terrain recursion, how to read shifting environments like a language, how to shape combat tempo around movement rather than command. All of it rooted in Terran irregular logic. Not every instructor acknowledged the origin. Some still spoke in terms that made the ideas feel native, referring to them as emergent tactics or responsive field theories. But the cadets knew. They referenced Voss's early deployments without naming him, traced auxiliary footage frame by frame, diagrammed formations that never followed Dominion angles, yet always closed the battlefield with surgical precision. Doctrine had absorbed the myth while stripping the name, and in that omission, Voss had become something more enduring than a rank. He had become the margin between survival and obedience. Among the cadets now leading the next generation of simulations was Tharn, once a second-tier Austrexi student who had mocked the chaotic Terrans during his early years. Now a doctrinal analyst in training, he walked the halls with quiet intent. His personal study log held every engagement from Trax's Fold to Drill 6. He had rewatched them enough times to memorize movement intervals and field decisions. When asked why he focused so much on auxiliary actions, he didn't speak of admiration. He spoke of pattern memory. They saw things faster, he once told a junior. They moved like the ground was already telling them where to go. We waited for permission. They didn't wait. At the southern end of the annex, mounted into the steel wall just outside the main projection room, was a bronze plaque. It bore no insignia, no emblem. Just a single sentence etched into metal, now dulled by the breath of passing cadets. Tharn stood in front of it one evening as the corridor lights dimmed behind him. He reached out and placed his hand against the plate. Not reverently, not ceremonially, but deliberately. The words were simple. You can't control chaos, but you can teach it where to land. No one watched him do it. No instructor logged it. No lesson was marked that day. In the final hours of instruction that cycle, cadets filed into the primary simulation chamber. On the central tier above them, a glass observation deck overlooked the room. Field Marshal Darren Voss stood there alone, hands folded behind his back, face unreadable. He did not speak. He did not nod. He did not interrupt. Below, the cadets activated the scenario. A simulated insurgency erupted across unstable terrain. Dominion formations hesitated. Auxiliary models advanced. Voss turned and left before the simulation completed. He never stayed for the endings. He didn't need to. His name would never be printed in the formal manuals. But every scenario that deviated from Dominion predictability carried his fingerprint. Every doctrine loop that permitted field improvisation bore the mark of a war fought and won without command approval. And in every cadet who no longer laughed at Earth's tactics, but studied them in silence, the legacy endured. Humans were no longer cannon fodder. They were the page Dominion now trained by. If this story gave you chills, hit that subscribe button. Now we want to hear from you. If you had command over Earth's entropy-based battle doctrine, what species or empire would you outmaneuver first and how? Would you collapse their formations, rewrite their simulations, or teach their own cadets why they lost? Drop your answers in the comments. We read every single one. Thanks for watching Stellar HFY, where doctrine is rewritten and chaos learns to land. See you in the next story.